Hello, everyone. So this week, we are going to talk about the next of our series of natural philosophers, the Pusikoi, also from Miletus or Miletos, Anaximenes. Now, I know that the name is pretty similar to the thinker, the very, very cool thinker, I think, that we covered last time, Anaximander. So Anaximenes, also of Miletus, that is fellow citizen, was a younger contemporary of Anaximander. And I think I had given you the dates last time. So if Anaximander, we have the dates are around 611 to 546 BC, because we have that exact date of 547 BC that he says he was, 64 years old or something, and he died the next year. We have Anaximenes, who was born, we believe, around 585 BC and died around 528 BC. So we're still in 6th century BC, but we're getting sort of more and more towards the next century. Right, so he was a younger contemporary of Anaximander. He was possibly a friend, a pupil. We don't know. I mean, like as I said, with ancient philosophers, people had this tendency of thinking of them in this kind of a guru shishya parampara, like the teacher and the student. But we don't know. I mean, he might have been a student, but he was also a successor of Anaximander. Now, if you recall, like very short summary of where we got to with Anaximander, after Thales, the first philosopher, as he's often called. So with Thales, he was trying to come to this arche that we talked about, and he came to this idea, or he proposed this notion that water is arche, and this water is not just in the sense of okeanos, the begetter, the father of all kind of an idea, but more of it sort of is where everything begins, what everything is constituted by, where everything goes, because he's a monist, right? So this monism of Thales sort of led him to propose a kind of water as the constituent first principle and the constituent element, the primary element of all phenomena, right? So every single phenomenon, all phenomena comes from arche, even from water, even if it doesn't look like water. So whether it is trees or stones or air or fire, some form of water, and it takes some effort to try and grasp the kind of leap of imagination that they're doing, which is very different from the one done by the poets before. So with Homer and Hesiod, and with the common sort of beliefs, the religious mythopoetic beliefs as we call them, what Thales sort of proposed was a kind of conceptual philosophical generalization in which one of the different kinds of matter in the world then became the constituent of all kinds of matter. And then, as we saw with Anaximander, he took what we could call a step forward by making it a bit more abstract, in the sense that instead of choosing one element or one physical material that you can find in the world, he decided to try and look for something less perceptible, right? Less immediately physically tangible. So when he proposes that apeiron, the boundless, boundaryless, limitless, whatever you want to call it, infinite, is a substance of is the primary substance. This boundless or infinite is not exactly something that I can catch and hold, or something that I can touch. It's not something tangible. So that means that Anaximander went to really a level of abstraction that far exceeded the one that Thales was trying to propose. So, there is an abstraction in trying to think of, water, this one element, as constituting everything, as a physical element, a natural element. With Anaximander, there is a step forward. With Anaximander, you have a step towards abstraction, towards this idea of infinity, and a much more sort of a conceptual leap in that sense. Now with Anaximenes, at first sight, it will look like, and it may look like, that he's taking a step back from Anaximander, because instead of going further towards abstraction, he seems to say that, well, actually, I'm going back to saying one of the few elements that we can find in nature is the primary element, is the arche, and he proposes that air is arche. Right, but actually you would see, once we have the discussion, that he is actually taking a step forward from Anaximander. It's not a regressive move with Anaximenes. In fact, he is taking a step forward in terms of scientific method, if you want to call it that, right? So it's a step forward in terms of methodology, in terms of the conceptualizing of the whole problem. Because with Anaximander, as you noticed, I mean, it's great to say that apeiron, this infinite, is the primary substance. But motion, for example, was and change and alteration of matter was explained in this what I forgot, was it Theophrastus, Simplicius, one of them, called in rather poetic terms. And what were the rather poetic terms? Let me see if I can find it if I can in 1 minute, then that'd be great. In which he basically said that, according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for the injustice according to the assessment of time, right? As he describes these in rather poetic terms. And I can also tell you this was, yes, Theophrastus, right? Actually, it was Simplicius in giving a version of Theophrastus' account. Okay, so yeah, let's not go into that. So in rather sort of poetical terms, why? Because Anaximander was still thinking of motion in terms of this. It was not exactly. These were not anthropomorphic in the sense that you would find in Homer or Hesiod, but there is still a kind of, they are given some kind of a personality, right? Because, for example, if the hot and the cold, or the wet and the dry, and they're annoyed, they feel that there was an injustice done to them by the encroachment of the other, and they ally, and then they fight, and they take retribution for this injustice. And this is a rather, and we talked about this mythopoetic sort of element, and I can see why Theophrastus or Simplicius would think of it as a rather poetic way of thinking of motion, because it is not simply saying that motion is because of one thing pushing another, without any, I mean, it is giving it a kind of poetical reinterpretation in terms of injustice and retribution and recompense, justice, so it's almost as if these elements are thinking in terms of justice and injustice, even though they're not the same gods that you find in Homer and Hesiod. They're still, the hot, the cold, the wet, and the dry. So it's almost as if the abstract entities, remain abstract, but still think in, or still act in ways that you would assume, more thinking beings would act, right? Beings that can think and feel. So that's the reason why Theophrastus, or Simplicius rather, complains about the rather poetic terms of Anaximander. So what we see with Anaximenes really is this movement forward, this step forward, in which he explains change and alteration and motion in terms which are much more sort of naturalistic, much more mechanistic. There is a mechanism that he starts describing, which is, unlike Anaximander, where there was not much of a mechanism, it was more of a personalized sort of action that caused change, rather than a mechanism that causes change. And let me see if I can read out the section from Anaximenes, and this is still, I'm doing an introduction still. This is from Hippolytus, right? We also have something from, let me read this one from Theophrastus again. So Anaximenes, son of Eurystratus of Miletus, a companion of Anaximander, also says, like him, that the underlying nature is one and infinite, but not undefined, as Anaximander said, but definite. For he identifies it as air, right? So this is what people would assume is a step backward from Anaximander, in the sense that when Anaximander said that the underlying substance is indefinite, this apeiron, with Anaximenes it becomes something more definite and tangible and physical, which is air, right? And it differs in its substantial nature by rarity and density. And now this is what changes, right? So unlike the apeiron, where the apeiron itself contains opposites and they have personalities, right? They feel injustice and they take action, to redress this injustice and to bring back balance. Here, this air is a purely mechanistic thing, which itself differs in nature by rarity and density, this, and then he'll bring in these notions of condensation and rarefaction, that air itself becomes dense and rare, and this makes it much more mechanical. It doesn't need to have a personality to become dense and rare. In fact, something else could act upon it to make it dense and rare, though that doesn't necessarily happen in Anaximenes, but you can see that he's taking a step forward towards more mechanistic explanation of change. Being made finer, it becomes fire. Being made thicker, it becomes wind, then cloud, and then, when thickened still more, water, then earth, then stones. And you can see the series, right? So it's like this one substance, the same substance, which when it sort of becomes thicker and denser with density, with condensation, like if it is air, let's say, which is the neutral form of that substance, from air it would become what was this? Wind, then cloud, then water, then earth, then stones. So it becomes denser and denser, and when it becomes rarer and rarer, so as it goes towards rarity, it goes towards more fiery substances, right? So I mean, as you can see, there is a shift in Anaximenes's way of thinking about change and motion and alteration. And so, and the rest come into being from these. So all nature is understood from the change in rarity and density of this, neutral primary substance. In fact, now we are starting to think of arche as not simply, the arche as beginning and primary substance, but also the substance in its neutral state. Yeah, the arche is the substance in its neutral state, which then, changes into different things according to, how it undergoes changes. So he too makes motion eternal. And this is another sort of, this thing connects him to the earlier philosophers in that sense, that motion is eternal. And that means that air, again, does not need something else to act on it. And so he will, like, Anaximander or like Thales, be a monist, right? You don't need an external force to act on it. It'll move by itself. And says that change also comes about through it, right? Because, well, of course, if motion is eternal and air itself is capable of motion, then any change comes through air. So again, there is no second agent required to bring about change. Yeah. And I can read the second one from Hippolytus, which is similar, where he says, Anaximenes said that infinite air, that is, was the principle from which the things that are becoming, and that are, and that shall be, and gods and things divine, all come into being, and the rest from its products. The form of air is also of this kind. Whenever it is most equable, it is invisible to sight, right? This adds something. Whenever it's in this neutral, equable state, it is invisible to sight. And as you can see, this idea of air is also new, because remember, air before was this dark mist, right? This dark, dense mist. Even in Anaximander, this was this dark, dense mist, and through which he had this very cool idea of there being these little pipes, like pipe-like passages, from which fire breathes out and forms the heavenly bodies. Anyway. So this air is invisible, so this invisible thing he's calling air, this is a new thing. Yeah, where am I? Yeah, wherever it is most equable, whenever it is in its neutral state, it is invisible to sight. But is revealed by the cold and the hot and the damp and by movement, right? So the change, I mean, the understanding of change is via what we would now call thermodynamics, right? So the dynamism of matter is because of heat, right? When it becomes hotter, it becomes a rarer substance. When it becomes cooler, it becomes a denser substance. And so the way that Anaximenes understands change is via the action of heat. And the heat itself is through the action of motion, right? So when it is neutral and sitting still, it's invisible air, entirely neutral and equable. If it gets colder than that, then it becomes, wind and mist and cloud and rain and earth and stones and whatever, all those things. When it becomes hotter, it sort of turns into fire. So maybe steam first, whichever. No, steam I think would come. I don't know. Okay, you get the idea, right? So it's the action of the hot and the damp. And by movement. It is always in motion. For things that change do not change unless there is movement, right? So change is of course movement, and this is something that they're repeating, but we have already sort of assumed that any kind of change happens because of motion. But this is also something that is added, that the change in the equable nature of air comes because of the movement of air, right? Movement of air causes maybe movement makes it get hotter or cooler, and we'll see with other philosophers that they actually then elaborate on this idea that more movement makes it warmer, and it's sort of like so it's movement of air, and through becoming denser or finer, it has different appearances. For when it is dissolved into what is finer, it becomes fire, while winds again are air that is being condensed, and cloud is produced from air by felting, right? This idea of felting, of putting sort of things together in this dense state. When it is condensed still more, water is produced with a further degree of condensation. Earth is produced, and when condensed as far as possible, stones. The result is that the most influential components of generation are opposites, hot and cold. Okay, so I'll sort of stop reading from this now. So this is what I mean by this step forward that Anaximander takes, because if you think about it, when you're talking about Anaximander and the boundless and the apeiron, so this boundless, after separating out, acquires bonds. Acquires these bounds, but air can become, it acquires a new kind of bonds, right? Water or air or all these things. But air can become denser or rarer, hotter or colder, and still remain the same substance, right? It doesn't change its substantial nature. It is not separating out into different substances. And so it is, what Anaximenes is doing is that he is coming up with this distinction, which becomes very important in philosophy later, is this distinction between substance and quality, right? Because you have the same substance, but its quality, there is a qualitative change in that substance because of, the process that it has gone through, right? So there's a change between substance and quality. And in that sense, we can actually say that he's making a real sort of, intellectual advance, and by trying to think of the process of change much more scientifically and methodically than Anaximander or philosophers before him did. Right? Okay, thank you.